Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday, I go through my best of one, best of three, and sometimes a budget deck meta review for Standard in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So this is week 6, and this week I did find a budget list by Saffron Olive, who is a budget creator on MTG Goldfish. And so this is $100 in paper, and it isn't strictly a budget deck for Arena because it does run some rares. But the whole point is to set up a giant plot turn. So we have Doc Orlock, Grizzle Genius, which makes our plotting cards from your hand cost 2 less. And then everything else, every creature has some sort of plot center, or it has plot. So you can plot the Beast Bond Outcaster. When it enters, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you draw a card. Trailblazer, if you when a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So both of these will help you kind of refill your hand. And then we've got Visage Bandit, which can copy something on the battlefield. Railway Brawler, which has plot, and then whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put X+1/+1 counters on it, where X is its power. Helps us get some really big beef. We've got the Tumbleweed Rising, which creates an XX based off of the largest creature that you control. Canyon Crab, kind of to slow our opponent down. And then when we're plotting, we're not actually casting spells because they're like channeling. It's like activated ability. So this allows us to draw a card, then discard a card as we kind of set up our giant turn, as well as prevent getting run over by Mono-Red, for example. And then we've decided to run in 4 copies of the 3 Steps Ahead, which is the cancel with upside that we got Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and 4 copies of Fading Hope, which I think the Fading Hope might be the only card that's not actually from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. So very, if you played a lot of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, this could be a pretty easy deck to craft. As far as the lands go, we've got the Botanical Sanctum and the Dreamroot Cascade, so both the fast and the slow lands for Simic fixing. 2 copies of Field of Ruin to destroy some man lands, and then this deck was designed for best of 3 in mind. So we have Witness Protection, which is Simic is kind of the one downside to Simic is the removal that is available. So we have hard-hitting Question and Witness Protection if you need some interaction. Soul Guide Lantern to hate on the graveyard, particularly good against Temur control. 3 copies of Negate to destroy the, to protect your board after you do the Plot Storm from like Sunfalls or any form of Wrath. And then we've got a Disdainful Stroke again to protect from Sunfalls, and kind of Domain, works against Domain. Can work against Boros Convoke too, to counterspell the Knight Errant of Eos. And then we have Kinker Bloom as kind of our enchantment and artifact hate. So now for the best of 3 lists, and what I like to do is I like to use the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, which is some pretty top level play. And so there's 2 versions of the standard challenge 32. I don't know why they haven't created another name for it, but we'll go through the 3 tournaments over the weekend. And Golgari Midrange did quite well, and which is exciting because I was just about to talk about my Golgari Midrange sideboard guide this Friday. So that's pretty good timing. And so this Friday I'll be going over the specific cards and which archetypes they're good against, etc. And so we haven't really seen... We saw one list kind of creep in that was not really doing what Golgari Midrange was doing classically. It was kind of preying on the Esper Midrange. I think that was in week 3. So I think the list that's closest to this one is all the way back in week 6 of Murders at Karlov Manor, and but we do see quite a bit of some substantial changes. So I'll kind of try to go over quickly what's been happening with the Golgari archetype. So they've dropped the 4 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat and brought in 3 copies of the Caustic Bronco, which is the one that allows you to dig off the top of your library at the cost of your life, or you can saddle it for 3, and then it's at the cost of your opponent's life. So you can hit into some expensive stuff and really hit your opponent for a fair amount of damage. Deciding to run 2 copies of the Glissa Sunslayer instead of just 1, bringing in 3 copies of the Graveyard Trespasser, which works nicely to hate on the graveyard, which is good against the 4-color Legends Slogurk deck and Temur Control, or the Temur Landfall combo deck, whatever you want to call it. 1 copy of the Karavik the Punisher, which is what we got at Outlaws of Thunder Junction, allows you to recast your black removal every time that you commit a crime at the cost of some life. And then we're ditching the 4 copies of the Preacher of the Schism and the 3 copies of Sentinel of the Nameless City, which were both the 4 toughness creatures in on the 3-drop slot. And dropping 1 Tranquil Frillback, still keeping 1 in the main, and bringing in 2 copies of the Archfiend of the Dross, which we've seen kind of come and go throughout the weeks, can be particularly hard for Mono-Red to deal with. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Hostile Investigator, which we got at Outlaws of Thunder Junction, is kind of a built-in 3-for-1 because it makes your opponent discard, gives you a clue token to draw, and then also gives you the 4/3 body. We're dropping 1 Shieldred the Apocalypse, but still keeping 1 in the main, and we're dropping the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal from the top end. We're deciding to bring in an additional copy of Liliana of the Veil, as well as an additional copy of Cutdown, 2 more Duress, and 1 Bitter Triumph for the removal. So we're cutting out 2 copies of the Go for the Throat and 1 copy of the Gix's Command. And as far as the lands go, we're bringing in 4 copies of the Blooming Marsh, which we got at the Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and is the fast land for Golgari. And bringing in 1 Cavern of Souls to help prevent things getting countered, and bringing in 1 additional field, or 1 Field of Ruin to hate on enemy manlands. And to do this, we're dropping 4 forests, 1 swamp, and 1 of the underground mortuaries, which was the Surveil land for Golgari. For the best of 3 sideboard, though, what we've seen is they've dropped 1 copy of Cutdown, 3 copies of Duress, 1 Long Goodbye, and brought in a 4th copy of the Path of Peril to really hate on Temur control, and dropped 1 Cruelty of Gix, so still have 1 of those, and then Liliana of the Veil has been removed from the sideboard into the main. Also dropped Sorin the Mirthless and Nissa the Ascended Animist, both the Planeswalkers that were being previously explored in Murders of Karlov Manor. And we've brought in 1 Outrageous Robbery, which is a way to mill our opponent and play with our opponent's cards. 2 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse, and 1 Tranquil Frillback in the sideboard instead of in the main. 1 Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, which we can then bring in if we want to bring that back. Again, this Friday I'll be talking about what matchups you do want to bring the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal in. Generally, it's against the more aggressive strategies of like Mono-Red and used to be Dimir Midrange, which we haven't seen until this week, which we're going to cover here shortly. 1 Deadly Cover-Up, which is the Wrath that we got, and then 1 Cease and Desist, which allows us to hate on our opponent's graveyard, as well as gives us some artifact and enchantment hate. So there's 2 different versions of Golgari Midrange. This one took 3rd place in the Standard Challenge 32 tournament. And so if we compare this to the list that I just talked about, you can see that they brought the Caustic Broncos up to 4. They brought in the 3 copies of the Free Strider Lookout, which is one of the cards that we saw in week 3 in the other Golgari list. Brought Glissa Sunslayer all the way up to 3 copies, dropped the Graveyard Trespassers, so not running that, but deciding to run an additional copy of Karavik the Punisher, and then dropping the Tranquil Frillbacks from the main, as well as the Archfiend of the Dross, and running an additional copy of the Hostile Investigator, as well as 2 more copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse, dropping 1 copy of Liliana of the Veil, as well as Nissa Ascended Animist, and running 2 less Cutdowns, bringing in Duress into the main, so an additional copy of 3 there. Bringing in Anoint with Affliction, and bringing in the Go for the Throats up to 4, and cutting the Bitter Triumphs, as well as 2 copies of the Gix's Command, so no Gix's Command in the main. And then as far as the lands go, not running the Cavern of Souls, but deciding to bring in 2 additional copies of Field of Ruin, and dropping the last copy of the Surveil land, the Underground Mortuary. So as far as the sideboard goes, we can see that they decided to cut the Extract the Truth, which is a way to have enchantment hate, as well as ditch the Outrageous Robbery, which is the mill card, and instead bringing in an additional copy of Terra Sunder, which can hit non-land permanents, so it kind of gives you that artifact enchantment hate, and bringing in 2 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse, 3 copies of the... Bringing in an additional copy of the Unlicensed Hearse, I believe, unless I have that wrong in my notes. And then cutting the 3 copies of Path of Peril, so only running 1 Path of Peril. Dropping the Tranquil Frillback, the Deadly Cover-Up, the Cruelty of Gix, and the Cease and Desist to bring in an additional copy of Anoint with Affliction, 2 copies of Liliana of the Veil, and I think really this one, Lily had a good week because Azorius Control was quite a popular pick. So Liliana is a really good tool against Azorius Control, making them discard every turn. 1 copy of Neutralize the Guards, which gives everything -1/-1. And I think this was being explored as a way to attack the Boros Convoke strategy. And but I haven't really seen that one a whole lot. Also bringing in a Hostile Investigator in the sideboard, so we can bring this all the way up to 4 if we're really hating on our opponent's hand. And then Gix's Command in the sideboard instead of the main, and 1 copy of Nissa Ascended Animist. So again, I'll be trying to cover as many of these cards as I can on Friday, and so look for that. And second place for the Standard Challenge 32 on May 25th was taken down by Dimir Midrange. And somebody in my community was asking, like, what happened to Dimir Midrange? Where has it gone? And so it's shown up. Here it is. So we haven't seen Dimir Midrange in the top 3 in the Standard Challenges since week 9 of Murders of Karlov Manor, where it was a very popular deck. It was the #1 most popular deck at the end of Murders of Karlov Manor. And so it was kind of like, where did it go? And really, I think that the pest control kind of hurt its matchup, especially against Esper Midrange, which the deck was largely preying on, especially because Esper Midrange also got the Concealed Courtyards, which help its tempo and its fixing. So this list compared to it, though, so we dropped the 4 copies of the Spyglass Siren to bring in an additional copy of the Fairy Mastermind, as well as 3 copies of Vadmir Newblood, which was one of the, it's a 2/2 that grows into a lifelink menace threat every time that you commit a crime. And we're dropping 1 copy of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, which kind of makes sense because we don't have the Spyglass Sirens to be getting in that early flying damage. And instead we brought in 2 copies of Lord Skitter Sewer King to really hate on the graveyard. Again, good against the graveyard hate is good against Temur Control and the Legends or Slogurk deck. And we're dropping the 4 copies of Preacher of the Schism, so all 3 decks decided to drop the Preacher of the Schism, and as well as the Urtai Resurrected, and this one dropping all 3 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse, as well as Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal. So clearly going for a more tempo, trying to shorten the curve down. And we have 2 copies of Tishana's Tidebinder to silence Planeswalkers and Azorius Control. There's a lot of really good targets for Tishana's Tidebinder, as I've covered in some of my best of 3 sideboard guides. And also bringing in the Hostile Investigator, again, just a built-in 3-for-1, very good for the value, as well as Liliana of the Veil. So our strategy really here against Azorius Control is just make them discard so they have no hand. We're also bringing in an additional copy of Duress, and I think, again, this really points to Azorius Control just being the most popular pick in the tournament scene. And then bringing Mirrex up to 4, again, lines up with that, and 1 additional Swamp for 2 islands. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see that they dropped the two Tishana's Tidebinders to bring it into the main, and dropped Negate, Blot Out, Path of Peril, Kaido Shizuki, and Liliana of the Veil to bring in 2 copies of Dreams of Steel and Oil. This one being able to attack artifact or creature cards specifically instead of Duress. And so if your Duresses are a non-hit, you can pull them out and bring in the Dreams of Steel and Oil. We got an additional copy of Duress if it's the opposite of that and you're playing against Azorius Control and you want all 4 copies. We've got 2 copies of Spell Pierce and 2 Unlicensed Hearse. Unlicensed Hearse being popular again for the graveyard hate against Temur Control and Slogurk. All right, so the second Standard Challenge 32 on May 25th, all 3 were taken down by Esper Midrange. So we have 3 different versions of Esper Midrange to look through this week. And so if we compare this one to last week's list, we can see that they dropped 1 copy of Dinnik Pious Apprentice, as well as 1 copy of No More Lies, to bring in 2 copies of Virtue of Loyalty. And the Caves of Kolios was dropped down 1. That one is the Painland, or Orsov. And brought in 1 Rafine's Tower, and dropped a Seachrome Coast to bring in an additional copy of the Shattered Sanctum, which was the slow land for Orsov. As far sorry, my brain was like derp. As far as the sideboard goes, so we've seen they've dropped 1 Tishana's Tidebinder, so still just 1 copy, but instead of 2. And then dropped Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal from the list, as well as 1 copy of Destroy Evil, and brought in an additional copy of Disdainful Stroke, and dropped 1 pest control, so just running 2 here, and then brought in a cut down as well as Lauren of the Third Path and 1 Gix's Command. So we've seen a fair amount of the lists deciding to bring in an additional copy of the cut down, and compared. Sorry, my brain is having a moment here. So the reason why we've seen less graveyard or less enchantment hate of like Destroy Evil and Lauren of the Third Path is because a lot of the Esper Midrange lists were playing around with getting rid of Wedding Announcement and Virtue of Loyalty. So keep your eye out on whether or not the Esper Midrange lists you're bumping into are running the enchantments or not. And if you want to know why, why some include it, why some don't, I do have a best of 3 sideboard guide for Esper Midrange. The enchantments tend to be better against the mirror match, so if you're anticipating more Esper Midrange, then Wedding Announcement is particularly good for that matchup. So second place was taken down by Falcon in Esper Midrange, and was the exact same list as the one that I covered in week 5. So if you just take away all of the changes that I said from the previous list, that's the list that Falcon was running, or you can just look at pull up the video from last week. Third place, though, was also running Esper Midrange by Jabberwocky. And so if we compare this one to the one last week, we can see that they decided to drop 2 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat, as well as 1 Fairy Mastermind and 1 Preacher of the Schism, and the Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, to bring in 2 copies of the Wandering Emperor. And then we cut 1 No More Lies and 1 Gix's Command, and brought in the 2 copies of the Wedding Announcement. So again, this one I think set up a little bit more to be good against the other Esper Midrange decks. And again, if you want the specifics, I highly recommend the Best of 3 sideboard guide, because I'm able to go into each card more in depth in that video. And as far as the lands go, Cavern of Soul or Caves of Kolios was dropped as well, Dark Slick Shores, and brought in 2 Deserted Beaches. And always have a hard time finding the lands. So the Deserted Beach here is the slow land for Azorius, and brought out 2 copies of the Seachrome Coast, and brought in 2 Shipwreck Marshes, and really just trying to fix for the additional white that the enchantments bring in. So as far as the sideboard goes, we dropped 1 Tishana's Tidebinder, so still just 1 instead of 2. And we dropped both copies of Destroy Evil. Again, I think that card specifically is looking worse off because a lot of the Esper Midrange lists are dropping the enchantments. This one's not, but a lot of them are. And I mentioned the Virtue of Loyalties got brought in, right? Yeah. Okay. I'm struggling a little bit today. Sorry, bear with me. So we're dropping the Destroy Evils. We're bringing in the Disdainful Stroke and 1 Long Goodbye, and cutting 1 Rest in Peace. I talked about this in my sideboard guide. I really like 2 Kutzil's Flankers and 1 Rest in Peace against Temur Control. And so the Rest in Peace don't actually work very well in duplicates. So it's nice to bring in 2 because then it increases your chances of hitting it. But then what you pay for is that if you end up getting 2 of them, they don't work well and you kind of have a dead card. So I like having only 1 here. Cutting the Wandering Emperor because we've brought it into the main, bringing the sideboard Duresses up to 2 in case we're up against Azorius Control or something that is running a low creature count, and then bringing in the 1 cut down to hate on the early aggression. All right, for Standard Challenge 64, which is the one that happens on Sunday, on May 26th, and is the large tournament of the week, we can see that although both versions of the Standard Challenge 32 that were dominated by all 6 top 3 spots were mid-range decks, all 3 of the Standard Challenge 64 are aggro decks. So Control feeling a little bit sad this week. And so we've got Gruul Aggro by Solus here, who took down first place. And we see, if we compare this to week 3, which we saw a top 3 finish of Gruul Aggro that week, we can see that they brought in 1 copy of the Cemetery Gatekeeper. This was one that we saw Mogged run in week 9 of Murders of Karlov Manor to really hate on Temur Control. And we're dropping the 2 copies of the Picnic Ruiner and bringing in a Giant Growth, and cutting 1 Audacity to bring in an additional copy of the Snakeskin Veil, and cutting the 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy to bring in 3 copies of the Lightning Strike. So to make room for this, we're dropping 1 mountain and we're deciding to run 19 lands instead of 20. As far as the sideboard goes, we can see that they moved the 1 Snakeskin Veil from the sideboard into the main, dropped the 2 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse, because we're bringing in the Cemetery Gatekeepers, which is good against the Temur control matchup, and then increasing the amount of Witchstalker Frenzies. Because we got rid of it in the main, we're going to include 1 additional copy in the sideboard. Second place was taken down by Boros Convoke by Max Medeiros. And if we compare this one to last week, we can see that they have done very little. But really, the only thing that's changed is the sideboard. So still, they're favoring running a 4-4 split of both enchantments, and just deciding to bring in the an additional copy of the Cavern of the Souls, and drop in a Gonjo Seed of the Empire, so just 1 of the legend land, as well as drop 1 Mirix, and brought in 1 mountain, so bringing in a little bit more red. And it's still up for debate about what exactly the best situation is land-wise for the Boros Convoke list. As far as the sideboard goes, though, they decided to drop the 3 copies of the Aven Interrupter, which was the thing that could bounce your opponent's thing, and then it plots it so that they have to cast it again the following turn at sorcery speed. That one was particularly good against the Sunfalls. Giving you that 1 more turn to kind of finish off the game. And instead, they're deciding to bring in an additional copy of Get Lost, and this one is really a nice one to bring in when they bring in Temporary Lockdown. Then you can bring in Get Lost to get your stuff back. It's not going to get you your stuff back that is tokens, though. And it does give you some Planeswalk hate as well. And then we're bringing in 2 copies of the Invasion of Gobekon. Again, this is a card that I talked about. It works primarily better to slow your opponent down if you're up against Mono-Red or Esper Midrange. And again, if you want more details about each card in this list and why it's here, I highly recommend my sideboard guide. And then third place for the Standard Challenge 64 on May 26th was taken down by Mono-Red Aggro by Deleon91. And so we've decided to bring in the 4 copies of Phoenix Chick. Usually we don't see this in best of 3. We do see it a fair amount in best of 1. But Phoenix Chicks usually get cut, so interesting to see this one being brought in. Dropping 2 copies of the Charming Scoundrel and bringing in 4 copies of Squee Dubious Monarch, and so a little bit more creature-centric than the previous list on last week. And dropping 1 copy of Play with Fire, and to bring in 2 more copies of Witchstalker Frenzy. We're cutting the Urabrask's Forge, which the other list was starting in the main, as well as cutting 3 copies of the Scorching Shot, and dropping Mirix, as well as 1 Mishra's Foundry for 2 mountains. So to try to give us a little bit less colorless lands in the main. As far as the sideboard goes, they've ditched the 3 copies of the Cemetery Gatekeeper that Mogged was running, and the previous list was running as well, that I mentioned is particularly good against the Temur Control or Temur Landfall combo deck, and instead is deciding to bring in an additional copy of In the Festivities to hate on Boros Convoke, and bringing in an additional copy of Lithomantic Barrage. This one was one that typically, like in my sideboard guys, has a low amount of data, but any deck that's a white or blue deck, so like Esper Midrange, the Lithomantic Barrage is a pretty decent card to bring in. We brought 4 copies of the Soul Guide Lantern in to hate on the graveyard decks, so this being the answer instead of the Cemetery Gatekeepers for the Slogurk deck and Temur Control or Landfall. And we're dropping the 2 copies of the Elder Dragon War, which was a Wrath that I think was being explored against the Boros Convoke last week, and dropping 2 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse, again leaning on the Soul Guide Lanterns, and dropping the Planeswalker package, so no Chandras and no Koth Fire of Resistance, and instead we're bringing in Furnace Punisher, which can punish our opponent if they're playing multiple non-basic lands, can kind of hate on Domain, and or really anything that's running a multicolored space. And then 3 copies of the Urabrask's Forge in the sideboard instead of the main. You're going to bring this in against the more grindy matchups that struggle against the artifact hate. And I will be revisiting Mono-Red Aggro again, so I plan to cover it 2 Fridays from now, and it'll be the last kind of closing of Outlaws of Thunder Junction as we get ready for Modern Horizons, which won't really affect Standard, but will be the new set, and a lot of focus will be spent on that as far as draft is concerned and such. So we'll see how Standard changes throughout the weeks, and but yeah, so look for that 2 Fridays from now if Mono-Red in best of 3 is your jam. And if you're a best of 1 player, fear not, I do cover best of 1 every week. I like to go over the top 8 according to a tracker called Untapped. So this week, we are getting kind of fairly late into the set. We know week 6, things are starting to kind of be stabilized. So number 1, according to Untapped, was Rakdos Aggro, and I've covered that one a fair amount. But if you are interested, I've done a variety of different varieties. Wow. But the one that is, according to the tracker, the number 1 is the one that I covered last week, so it's the exact same list as week 5. And then Mono White Humans was number 2, and that was also the same list as week 5. Again, as we get further into the set, you're going to see less and less innovation and less exploration, and kind of it's settled on what the best version is. Mono-Red Prowess, though, is still kind of trying to find its sweet spot, and so this week the top performing list was deciding to bring in 2 copies of Kinra's Spellspear and cut the Godric and Cloaked Reveler and Squee Dubious Monarch, which was from the top end, and also dropping the 2 Shocks, as well as 2 copies of the Demonic Ruckus, which is the enchantment that gives +1/+1 and Menace, and then you can plot it, and it gives you draws you a card. And instead, we're leaning more into the 1-turn combo, kill them, get them dead. So Twin Inferno can give your creature double strike. Oh, excuse me. Oh my gosh, sneezing into yawning. I'm the world's best streamer. All right, so Twin Inferno can give your creature double strike. Works particularly well with the Slickshot Show Off to get them killed in 1 turn. And Case of the Crimson Pulse gives us some additional dig. And we're bringing in 2 copies of the Mishra's Foundry, so we're deciding to run 20 lands instead of 18. And then Mono-Red Aggro was number 4, but that was also the same list as I covered last week in week 5. Boros Convoke, we continue to see some changes, largely still debating about what the best land approach is in best of 1. So we dropped the Ocean Frontliner and brought in 3 more copies of the Charming Scoundrel, which has interesting synergies in this deck because you can create a treasure token that you can then blow up with Gleeful Demolition, giving you an additional thing to kind of help you not just have this be a dead card in hand. And then if you have no cards in hand, you can discard nothing and draw a card. A lot of people miss that when I play against them on the ladder. Bringing in an additional copy of the Sanguine Evangelist and dropping the 2 copies of the War Leader's Call. And I think this really reflects there just being less Azorius control in the best of 1 meta. And also dropping the 2 copies of Cavern of Souls, which also points to less control. And bringing in an additional copy of the Gonjo Seat of the Empire, which have seen kind of come and go, whether or not you're running 2 of the the legendary white land. No Inspiring Vantage. So I think given more time, we're going to see more lists including the fast lands that we got, Outlaws of Thunder Junction, but because they are rares, they do kind of you have to craft them, and we see it heavily in best of 3, not as much in best of 1. And then dropping 1 Mirrex, again kind of pointing to Azorius control falling a little bit out of the meta, and bringing in a Mountain of Plains and 3 copies of the Sundown Pass. Personally, I would just replace the 3 copies of the Sundown Pass with 3 copies of the Inspiring Vantage, because it's more important to have your lands in the first 3 turns than it is have an untapped land later in the game. So personally, that's what I would do, but the reason why I look at the tracker is to remove my bias, and so the tracker is not running the Inspiring Vantage. Number 6, according to Untapped, was Mono Black Skeletons, and I haven't covered this one since week 1 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, where it looked to be a new archetype, and it's definitely here to stay, and it's been flirting around with being in the top 8 every week, usually just not quite making it. And so this week it made it, and it has undergone some changes since week 1. So it's dropping 1 copy of the Tiny Bones the Pickpocket and bringing in 4 copies of Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, which really helps the deck refuel and get into additional threats. We're dropping 3 copies of Gisa the Hellraiser. This card has honestly just been too slow for best of 1. And bringing in 2 copies of Duress, which, unless you're coming up against mono-white humans, is a reasonable card to include in the main. And then we're bringing in 1 copy of the Insatiable Avarice, which is a black card that's able to tutor for a specific card in your deck, and or you can just use it for additional card draw if you don't want to put that card on top. And then it can also be used for burn. So don't forget that you can use this to hit your opponent for 3 damage, which can matter in an aggressive archetype like this one. Dropping 1 copy of Cutdown, and bringing in 2 additional copies of Long Goodbye, which, right here, yep. And deciding to drop all 4 copies of Tiny Bones Joins Up. And I think that really makes sense. If you're going to drop the Gisas and go for a lower curve, then Tiny Bones Joins Up was pretty much brought in because of the synergies with Gisa, because it commits a crime when a legendary creature enters the battlefield and makes your opponent mill, and so Gisa immediately gets triggered and creates those 2/2 zombies, so it was a nice synergy with that. But since we're only running 1 Gisa, then it makes sense to drop the Tiny Bones Joins Up. And this list is deciding to bring in an additional copy of Field of Ruin to really hate on the opponent's lands. And notably, remember, you can use this to commit a crime. So if that's important with Gisa in play, you can use Field of Ruin to do that. We're dropping the 2 copies of Sandstorm Verge, which was being explored as a way to commit crimes repeatedly from your lands. I think favoring it, personally, after playing the deck, I don't think you need to do it very often. You can commit crimes other ways, as well as just the Field of Ruin. And we're also dropping 2 Swamps to bring in 3 Myrics. So especially with the increase of colorless lands, because Myrics fixes for a turn but then becomes colorless, I think it makes sense to not run the Sandstorm Verges. Oh, and I forgot. So this week, number 7, Temur Control. It was basically the same list as week 5. So I usually, my magic number is 3 cards. If there are 3 cards that change, then I'll cover it. But if there's not even that, then I'll just skip it, right? I'll just cover it in words. So Temur Control decided to drop Colossal Sky Turtle, as well as 1 copy of World Soul's Rage, which we've seen before, so preferring to run 3 copies of World Soul's Rage instead of 4, and brought in an additional copy of Spelunking, and went back up to 30 lands by bringing in a additional copy of the Riveteer's Overlook. So very similar to what I covered last week. And then also Celestia Enchantments made it onto top 8. So just like the Mono Black Skeletons, we hadn't seen that since week 1 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And so that one was, I've covered that list 1,000 times throughout all of the months. And compared to the one that I covered in week 1, it was dropping 2 Brushlands for a Forest and a Plains, which we've seen time and time again, kind of this fluctuation of whether or not you're deciding to run more basics or more non-basics is kind of the only thing that fluctuates with that deck. So I hope this gives you a good idea of what's happening in the meta, and some inspiration for your own builds and your own ladder climbing. And if this is your jam, I do one of these every Monday, and then I also do some off-meta stuff on Sundays. For the time being, I've been doing sideboard guides on Friday, although I think we're going to kind of shift away from that. And I did compete in the Arena Open, so day 1 will be posted later this week, as well as some of my drafts, because I do like to do some limited. And on Saturdays, I'll be going over kind of an off-meta thing that we like to explore. Last week we did Simic Cookies, so there's been some suggestions to look into zombie decks and such. So if you place your vote for the next one, and if your favorite archetype's not there, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll do my best to try to include it the next week. So thanks for being a part of my community. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend or wonderful week, and I will catch you all later. Good luck with your trophies, and maybe I'll see you on the ladder.